A farmer noticed that his horse stubbornly refused to drink water from the trough. At first he thought it was just a whim, but when he decided to dig the ground beneath it, he was horrified by what he found. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun had not yet climbed to its harshest height when Jonas Hale stepped out onto the porch of his ranch house, the wooden boards creaking beneath his boots. The land stretched wide and endless before him, a sweep of pale grass broken by the dark silhouettes of mesquite and oak, the distant shimmer of heat already rising off the Texas plains. This land had been his father's before him, and his father's before that, and though time had stripped it down to its bare bones, dusty soil, creaking fences, and weathered barns, Jonas had never thought of it as poor. It was steady like him, and it yielded enough to keep a man alive if he treated it with respect. He lifted his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, even though the day had only just begun. Already the air buzzed with cicadas, their shrill chorus blending with the occasional lowing of cattle. Somewhere beyond the barn a rooster crowed, late to his duties but insistent all the same. Jonas let his eyes fall on the heart of his place, the old oak that shaded the well, and the wooden trough he had built years ago with his own hands. The trough stood there as it always had, waiting for the animals to come to it when the morning grew hot enough to send them searching for cool relief. He walked the short distance toward the corral, his boots crunching in the gravel. His horse stood there, as reliable as the sunrise. Grace was her name, though he often called her Gracie in the quiet moments when it was just the two of them. A strong bay mare with a deep chest and intelligent eyes, she had been with him since his younger days, when the ranch was still fresh under his stewardship and his father's voice still rang in his ears. Grace had never failed him. She had carried him to town in storms, hauled fence posts through mud, and even once stood steady when a rattler coiled too close and his hands shook with the rifle. If there was one creature in the world Jonas trusted without condition, it was her. That morning, however, something was off. He noticed it at once as he unlatched the corral gate and called to her with the same low whistle he always used. She came willingly, her ears pricked forward, her stride easy. She pressed her muzzle against his hand and blew a warm breath into his palm. He smiled, scratching the familiar patch between her eyes where the hair grew a little darker. Then he led her toward the trough. The water inside was clear, filled fresh from the well at dawn, its surface trembling with the faint breeze that swept across the yard. Cattle had already drunk from it. He could see their prints in the dust nearby. But Grace hesitated. Her ears flicked back, her nostrils widened, and she stopped short a few feet away. Jonas tugged the lead rope gently, urging her closer, but she stiffened, planted her hooves, and let out a sharp snort that made him frown. "Now, girl," he muttered under his breath, though he knew words were useless. He brought the rope slack, stepped beside her shoulder, and tried again. She followed him willingly until the trough loomed close, and then once more she balked, jerking her head sideways, the whites of her eyes flashing. She stamped once, twice, and backed up a step as though something unseen waited to leap from the ground itself. Jonas narrowed his eyes at the water. He bent down, scooped a palmful, and let it trickle between his fingers. It was cool, clean, without a hint of smell. He cupped it to his lips and tasted it. Nothing unusual. The same water he had been drinking for years. The same spring that had kept his stock alive through drought and summer blaze. He looked back at Grace, who pawed the ground, her ears pinned flat against her head. Other animals had no such qualms. Chickens darted by and pecked at the ground nearby. One of the heifers ambled close, lowered her heavy head, and drank greedily from the trough. Grace only snorted and backed away, tugging the rope from his hand. She circled once in the dust, her body tense, then came back to him but kept her distance from the trough itself. Jonas stroked her neck, feeling the ripple of muscle beneath her hide. It troubled him. Grace was not a nervous horse. She had stood her ground against lightning storms, coyotes, and rifle fire. For her to shy away from a simple trough was uncharacteristic to the point of absurdity. He wondered if something had startled her earlier, perhaps a snake coiled in the shade or a raccoon nosing about for scraps. But as he inspected the trough, running his calloused fingers along the wood, he saw nothing. No claw marks, no broken boards, no sign of intrusion. The water itself was undisturbed, catching the reflection of the oak's sprawling branches overhead. He lingered there longer than he meant to, his brow furrowed. Grace stood by him, shifting her weight, blowing through her nostrils, eyes still fixed on the trough as though it were a thing to be feared. Jonas felt the first whisper of unease crawl along his spine. Animals did not spook without reason. They sensed things a man's eyes or ears might miss. He remembered the drives he had worked as a young man, when cattle would turn stubborn at the edge of a trail, refusing to cross for no reason visible. The smart drovers never forced them. There was always a reason, be it rattlers hidden in the brush or a weak bridge ready to give way. Still, he shook his head, pushing the thought aside. Perhaps it was nothing more than a whim. Horses had their moods, same as people. Maybe tomorrow she would drink as usual, and this little episode would be forgotten. He led Grace away and gave her a bucket filled from the same well, and she drank it without hesitation, lowering her head and finishing it to the last drop. That only deepened the mystery. By late morning, the sun was high, burning down hard. Jonas busied himself with chores, mending a fence line, hauling hay, checking the cattle for ticks. Yet all the while, the image of Grace balking at the trough lingered in his mind. When he returned near midday to check on the water, he found it as clear as before, though warmed now by the sun. He bent again to taste it, more out of stubbornness than thirst, and found nothing wrong. But Grace, watching from the shade of the barn, only tossed her head and refused to approach. That night, as the cicadas gave way to the hoot of owls, Jonas sat on his porch with a tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm in his hand. The stars burned fiercely above, unclouded by town smoke, and the land was silent except for the faint rustle of wind. He thought again of the trough, of the way Grace had behaved, and he felt the stir of something he could not quite name, a wrongness. Not in the water, not in the wood, but in the place itself. He recalled how his father used to say the land remembered things, that it held on to what had been done upon it, good or bad. Jonas finished his coffee, set the cup aside, and leaned back, listening to Grace shifting in the corral. She was quiet now, calm, as though nothing had happened. Yet he knew in his bones she would not drink from that trough come morning. He also knew himself too well to believe he could let it go. Whatever the cause, he would find it. He owed that much to the mare who had carried him through half his life. The night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead, and the ranch lay in its familiar silence. But Jonas Hale slept lightly, and when dreams came, they were filled with the sound of hooves stamping against hard-packed earth, and the image of clear water shimmering in the moonlight, waiting, patient, and strangely forbidding. The next morning dawned just as the last had, the pale light spreading across the Texas plains, the air already heavy with the promise of another blistering day. Jonas Hale rose before the sun, as he always did, his body accustomed to the rhythm of farm life. He moved through the familiar motions of feeding the hens, scattering grain that gleamed gold in the early light, and checking the small herd of cattle penned near the southern fence line. Everything was as it should be, every sound and every smell as ordinary as the countless mornings before. And yet, beneath it all, there lingered that faint undercurrent of unease, a tension woven into the silence, carried over from the day before, like a splinter under the skin. When at last he came to the corral where Grace waited, her bay coat catching the first rays of sun, he watched her carefully. She greeted him in her usual manner, with a low nicker and a push of her soft muzzle against his chest, as though eager for his attention. He stroked her neck, ran his hand along her flank, and spoke in that quiet tone reserved for her alone. There was nothing unusual in her behavior until he led her once more toward the trough. The wooden structure stood under the great oak, as it had always done, half in shadow, half in light, the water within dark and still. Grace halted again 3 feet away, the rope pulling taut between them. Jonas frowned, urging her forward. She braced herself and refused, hooves digging into the dust. He could feel the tremor of her muscles through the lead rope, the tension vibrating like a wire about to snap. She tossed her head, ears pinned, and let out a breath that sounded almost like a warning. Jonas released the rope and stepped back. She calmed at once, her body easing, but her eyes never left the trough. He tried again, filling a separate bucket from the well, and she drank eagerly, as though thirst had been gnawing at her all night. When the bucket was empty, she licked the last drops from its rim and turned her head away, showing no interest in the water, only a few steps distant. It was the second day of this behavior, and Jonas's unease deepened. He could no longer pass it off as a fleeting whim. Something about that place disturbed her. He crouched by the trough once more, inspecting every joint of wood, every nail. His fingers traced the iron bands, rough with rust, the planks dry but sound. He leaned over the water, breathed in its scent, dipped his hands beneath the surface and rubbed the coolness against his face. There was nothing there, nothing visible, nothing to explain her stubborn refusal. That night he lay awake longer than usual, listening to the creak of the rafters and the occasional call of an owl. His father's voice came to him from memory, sharp and steady as it had been in life. "Animals don't lie, son. When a dog growls at an empty doorway or a horse spooks at bare ground, you'd best pay attention. They hear more, see more, feel more than we ever will." Jonas had shrugged off those lessons in his youth, eager to believe in the certainty of what his own eyes could prove. But time had taught him to respect such wisdom. He had seen cattle refuse a trail where a bridge lay rotten just out of sight, had seen dogs bark at buildings later found to be filled with rot or worse. On the third morning, Grace's reaction grew sharper still. She started forward willingly enough, but when the trough loomed into sight, she jerked back so violently the rope burned against Jonas's palm. She reared slightly, front hooves pawing at the air, then came down snorting and sidestepping away. Jonas steadied her, murmuring words meant to calm, but his heart pounded harder than hers. Never in all their years together had she resisted him so strongly. When she finally stood quiet again, her sides heaving, she looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold some knowledge beyond his grasp. Jonas set down the rope and stood alone before the trough. He crouched again, staring at the water until the reflection of his own face stared back. The surface trembled with the faintest breeze, and in that quiver of light he saw the weariness in his eyes, the hard lines etched by sun and wind. Nothing stirred beneath the surface. Still, Grace refused to touch it, though her thirst was plain. By evening, his patience had worn thin. He cleaned the trough thoroughly, scrubbing the boards until they glowed pale against the darkening sky. He poured out the old water, hauled fresh buckets from the well, and filled it again. Sweat dripped from his brow, his arms ached. But when he stepped back to watch, Grace only snorted and turned her head away. That was the final blow to his doubts. He sat on the porch later, the cool of twilight settling over the land. The horizon burned with streaks of crimson and violet, and the first stars winked awake above. Jonas's thoughts were heavy. He remembered stories he had once heard in town, told in half whispers over mugs of bitter coffee or in the shadowed corners of the saloon. They were old stories, so old he had paid them little mind at the time. Stories of Silas Ward, the man who had owned this ranch long before Henderson, before Jonas's father ever set foot on it. Ward had been a hard man, they said, a man who took more than he gave, who drove neighbors off their land and collected debts with fists instead of paper. He had disappeared one winter, simply vanished, leaving behind debts, grudges, and land no one much wanted until Henderson bought it cheap at auction. Henderson held it for years before selling it on to Jonas's father. People seldom spoke of Ward anymore, but when they did, it was with a curl of the lip or a glance over the shoulder. Jonas had not thought of him in years, yet now the memory rose unbidden, as though Grace herself had dragged it from the shadows. He stared at the trough in the fading light, the way it squatted beneath the oak, silent and stubborn. Something about that patch of ground gnawed at him. Grace had made her warning clear. It was not the water. It was not the wood. It was the earth itself, the place where the trough stood. And though Jonas tried to push the thought away, a certainty began to grow inside him, like a seed breaking soil. That earth had been disturbed once, long ago. He rose from the porch, his decisions solidifying with every step. Tomorrow he would move the trough aside. He would take up his shovel and dig. He did not know what he expected to find, Perhaps nothing more than an old tree root or a forgotten stone. But if the ground held some secret, better to unearth it than live with the gnawing question. As he bolted the barn door and latched the gate for the night, the unease in his chest shifted into resolve. Grace watched him from the corral, ears pricked, her body calm now that the trough was left alone. He gave her a final pat and looked once more toward the oak where the wooden structure lay in shadow. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would break the silence of that ground. When he finally lay down in his narrow bed, the land outside was hushed save for the rustle of the night wind. He closed his eyes, but sleep came slowly. In his dreams, the trough stood alone under the stars, and beneath it the soil pulsed like a living thing, waiting, patient, keeping whatever truth it held buried deep. The morning broke with the same relentless clarity as all mornings did on the Texas plains, the horizon stretching wide, the sky already flushed with heat before the sun had properly climbed. Jonas Hale had barely slept, his mind circling the decision he had come to the night before, turning it over and over like a stone in his hands. He had risen early, as he always did, but this time his steps did not carry him first to the hens or the cattle. Instead, they carried him directly to the oak tree in the trough that squatted beneath its branches. It stood there innocent as ever, filled to the brim with clean water, its surface untroubled. Yet Jonas felt a heaviness in his chest as he looked at it, the way a man might look at the closed door of a room he knows he should not enter. Grace stood in the corral some distance away, her ears pricked, her eyes locked on him as if she knew exactly what weighed on his mind. He dragged the trough aside with steady hands, its legs scraping across the packed earth. The structure was heavy, but he had built it himself years ago, with thick timbers meant to withstand both weather and animal. And though his arms strained, he managed to shift it several feet from where it had rested all this time. The ground it left behind was bare and darkened, more compact than the surrounding yard, as though it had been pressed down firmly at some point in the past. Jonas stared at it for a long moment before reaching for his shovel. He set the blade to earth and pressed down with his boot. The soil gave reluctantly, hard and dry at first, crumbling away in pale chunks. He lifted the first spadeful, then another, and for a while there was nothing but the steady rhythm of his digging, the sound of metal biting soil, the scrape of boot against shovel, the soft grunt of effort. Sweat ran down his temples and soaked into the collar of his shirt. Though the day was still young, he worked methodically, each shovelful tossed aside, each cut into the ground deliberate. A foot down, he paused to wipe his brow. Already he could see the soil changing. What had begun as dusty brown dirt soon deepened into a heavier, denser layer. The color shifted to a clay-like red, more compact, more difficult to pierce. Jonas frowned. He knew the lay of his land well. The soil here did not turn to clay so suddenly, not unless it had been disturbed and replaced. He drove the shovel in again, the blade clanging slightly as it struck a small stone. He pried it loose and kept going. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the soil was not natural. It had been filled back in at some point, layered down in a way that no natural earth ever settled. His heart beat faster as he straightened for a moment, leaning on the handle of the shovel. He felt Grace's eyes on him from across the yard. She had not moved, but her stillness was telling. Her attention was absolute, ears pricked, body tense. Jonas forced himself back to work. He cut deeper, the shovel biting harder, his muscles aching from the effort. After several more strokes, the sound changed. Instead of the dull thud of dirt giving way, there was a sharper, hollower note, as though he had struck something with more substance. He froze. The breath caught in his chest, and lowered himself to his knees. With his calloused hands, he brushed the soil away, fingers sifting through the packed clay until they struck something smoother, harder. He uncovered the corner of what looked like old wood, dark and splintered, the grains swollen with age. His heart thudded. He cleared more, exposing a length of board, nailed and banded with rusted iron. The shovel had struck what appeared to be the remnants of some kind of cover. He pressed harder, tearing at the soil with his hands until more of the surface was revealed. The boards were set close together, bound with nails that had nearly dissolved into orange flakes. This was no root or natural obstacle. It was man-made, a structure buried deliberately. The smell came next, faint but distinct, a dampness rising from beneath, carrying with it the sour tang of earth that had been sealed away too long. Jonas drew back, swallowing hard, then leaned in once more. He pressed against one of the boards, and it shifted beneath his weight with a low groan. Dust puffed upward. He rocked it again, harder this time, and the wood cracked, splitting along its weakened grain. A rush of stale air burst upward, heavy and damp, as though it had been waiting decades for release. Jonas sat back on his heels, his chest tight. The hole yawned before him, dark and uninviting, the broken boards marking its rim. He knew now he had found the remains of some kind of pit, perhaps an old cellar or storage hole, perhaps something else entirely. He hesitated, his hands shaking faintly, though his grip on the shovel was strong. He thought of Grace, of the way she had balked and refused, and the unease that had plagued him for days grew into something larger, something closer to dread. Still, he pressed forward. He widened the hole, breaking away the remaining boards until there was space enough to lower himself inside. The air was damp and heavy, the scent of rot stronger the deeper he went. His boots found a rung of what must once have been a ladder, its wood soft beneath his weight. He tested it cautiously, ready to spring back if it gave way, but it held, groaning beneath him as he descended slowly into the shadows. At the bottom, his boots sank slightly into soil that was damp and clinging, unlike the dry crust of the yard above. He stood in a cramped space, his shoulders nearly brushing the low beams overhead. The faint light from above barely reached him, catching on the outlines of stone and wood, the rough construction of a small chamber dug into the earth and braced by timbers long since rotted. His eyes adjusted gradually, and as he turned, he saw it. In one corner, half sunken into the soil, rested a chest. It was larger than a saddlebag, but smaller than a trunk, fashioned of iron-bound wood, its surface scarred with rust, its chains dull with age. Jonas's heart gave a sudden jolt. He approached, his boots squelching faintly in the damp earth. The chest was sealed, the lock twisted with corrosion, the chains wrapped around it like a cocoon. He touched it with cautious fingers, feeling the chill of the metal seep into his skin. It was real. It had weight. It had waited here, hidden, for longer than he had walked this land. For a long moment he simply stood there, staring down at the object, his mind whirled with questions, with the press of possibilities. What could it hold? Tools long forgotten? Weapons? Money? Or something darker? Something tied to the shadow of Sila Ward's name that had haunted this land in whispers? He lifted the chest carefully, straining at its weight. Whatever lay inside shifted with a muffled thump, heavy but not loose like coins. He carried it upward, the old ladder creaking with every step until he emerged once more into the harsh light of day. He set the chest down on the ground beside the pit, his chest heaving, his shirt damp with sweat. Grace, watching from the corral, stamped her hoof and tossed her head, her body tense, as though she too understood the significance of what he had uncovered. Jonas stood over the chest, the earth still damp on his hands, and let his breath steady. The hole behind him gaped like a wound in the ground. The boards scattered, the secret revealed at last. Whatever he chose to do next, he knew the moment of no return had already passed. Grace had been right. Something had been wrong with that patch of earth, and now he had unearthed it. As the sun climbed higher and the cicadas screamed in the heat, Jonas wiped the sweat from his brow and crouched before the chest. His fingers hovered over the corroded chains, hesitant but drawn forward all the same. The truth was waiting for him, sealed inside iron and wood, and though every instinct screamed caution, another, deeper instinct pulled stronger. He had to know. He had to see. The day stretched long, and the silence of the land pressed in around him. Jonas Hale, farmer and son of farmers, stood before a buried relic of another man's life and choices, his shovel lying discarded in the dirt, his horse watching with unblinking eyes. The digging was done, but the real unearthing had only just begun. The chest sat heavy on the ground beside the torn earth, its iron bindings streaked with rust, the chains curled around it like the embrace of something that did not want to let go. Jonas Hale crouched before it with his hands pressed to his knees, his breath slow but steady now that the first rush of discovery had passed. He could hear the cicadas shrilling high in the oak branches, the distant low of cattle, the creak of wood as the trough he had moved leaned awkwardly against the barn wall. The world continued as it always did, but to Jonas it felt as though the air had thickened, as though the ranch he had known all his life had shifted subtly into something unfamiliar. Grace stood at the far end of the corral, still and attentive, her head raised, her eyes fixed on him and the thing he had pulled from the earth. He rested his fingers against the cold iron of the chains. They flaked at his touch, leaving a powdery stain of rust on his skin. Whoever had placed the chest here had meant for it to remain, to stay hidden where no curious hand might ever reach. Yet Grace had known, and through her warning, he had found it. He considered for a long moment what he was about to do. A man who digs up another man's secrets often finds more than he bargained for. But there was no turning back. The earth was already disturbed, the hidden thing already uncovered. To leave it sealed now would be to live with a gnawing question that would eat away at him every day he walked this land. He found a pry bar in the barn and returned to the chest. The lock was little more than a corroded lump, the chain links brittle where time had chewed them down. With several sharp strikes in the levering of the bar, the chain gave way with a groan, snapping apart in a spray of red flakes. He unwound the remnants and pulled the lid upward. It stuck for a moment, the iron hinges protesting, then gave with a sound that seemed too loud for the stillness around him. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had preserved them better than he expected, lay a bundle of papers. They were bound with string, their edges brown but intact. Alongside them were smaller items, a leather pouch that clinked faintly when he lifted it, a ring dulled with tarnish but engraved with initials, and scraps of cloth that had rotted almost to dust. He unwrapped the canvas carefully, laying the documents on the ground beside him. The papers smelled faintly of oil and age, carrying the sharp tang of ink that had not quite faded. The first sheet he unfolded was a ledger page, columns of numbers scrawled in a tight hand. Names he did not recognize listed beside debts and amounts. He turned another page and saw more of the same, then another filled with signatures, some shaky, some firm. These were promissory notes, deeds of transfer, obligations written in ink but backed, no doubt, by the threat of force. Jonas felt a heaviness in his chest as he read line after line. These were the lives of men reduced to scratches on paper. Neighbors, perhaps, farmers like himself who had been pressed into surrendering what was theirs. He set the ledger aside and turned to the small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn soft with age. Inside were entries written in a hurried hand, the script jagged, impatient, the words more like confessions than records. Jonas read phrases that made his stomach tighten. Talk of payments collected with persuasion, of land taken when men could not meet their notes, of threats delivered in the dead of night. The writer did not name himself, but Jonas needed no confirmation. This was the hand of Silas Ward, the man who had vanished decades before, the man whose shadow still lingered in the whispers of Dry Creek. As Jonas read further, the tone of the entries changed. The earlier confidence gave way to unease, then to outright fear. One entry described being followed, another spoke of angry men gathering in town, vowing that Ward's time was ending. The last pages grew more disjointed, words smudged as though written with a trembling hand. "I buried it where none will look," one line read. "Better hidden in the ground than taken by men who would use it against me." Another read, "If they come, I will have something to bargain with, though I trust no one." The final page was nearly illegible, the ink blotted and smeared, but Jonas made out enough to know that Ward had not trusted even his own kin. He had hidden the chest here beneath what had later become Jonas's trough, sealing it away with his secrets and perhaps his guilt. Jonas sat back on his heels, the notebook limp in his hands. The weight of what he held was heavier than iron. This was more than an old man's ramblings. It was evidence of lives broken, fortunes stolen, wrongs buried in silence. He thought of the families in town, some of them still struggling on poor soil, while men like Henderson had built comfortable houses on land acquired through means no one spoke of too loudly. Henderson had bought this ranch after Ward disappeared, and though Jonas had never suspected anything at the time, the connection now pressed on him like a lead weight. He opened the small pouch and tipped it into his palm. Coins spilled out, dull with tarnish but unmistakably valuable. Silver and gold glinted in the sun, stamped with marks from across the border. Some bore Mexican emblems, others older still, worn smooth by countless hands. Jonas turned one between his fingers. The metal warmed quickly in the heat of his skin. He thought of the men who had once held these coins. Men perhaps driven off their land so that Ward might line his pockets. Each piece was more than money. It was a fragment of someone's story, a fragment of a theft that still echoed through the land. He closed the pouch and set it aside, his attention returning to the notebook. The more he read, the more a picture formed in his mind. Ward had not simply been a hard man. He had been a predator, feeding on the weakness of others until he grew too bold. His disappearance had not been the result of whim or wanderlust. Someone had wanted him gone, perhaps the very people whose names filled the pages of his ledger. Jonas imagined the winter of Ward's vanishing, the cold winds sweeping across these plains, the silence in the saloon when his name was spoken for the last time. No body had ever been found, no grave marked his passing, but his presence had lingered all the same, bound up in secrets hidden under the soil. Jonas set the papers down and rubbed his temples. The land felt different now. The air above the pit seemed heavier, the oaks shade darker. He thought of Grace, her refusal to drink, her warning. She had known in some instinctive way that something wrong lay beneath that spot. Now he knew it too, and the knowledge weighed on him like a stone. He gathered the documents back into their canvas wrapping, tied them securely, and placed them inside the chest again. The ring he slipped into his pocket without thinking, the cool metal pressing against his thigh. He closed the lid but did not chain it. The act of resealing it seemed pointless now that its contents were known. He rose to his feet and looked out across the ranch. The cattle grazed in the distance, the hens scratched near the barn, the world unchanged and yet forever altered. What was he to do with what he had found? He could not bury it again, pretend it had never been unearthed. The papers spoke of crimes, of theft, of wrongs still unrighted, yet bringing them into the light would stir old resentments, rouse men who might prefer such matters remain forgotten. Jonas felt the weight of choice pressing on him. To do nothing was to carry the secret alone. To act was to invite danger. Grace whinnied softly from the corral, breaking his thoughts. He turned and saw her watching him still, her body tense, but her eyes calm. It was as though she knew the burden he carried and reminded him of the path that had led him here. It was her refusal that had uncovered this truth. Her instinct had guided him, and he could not turn away from it now. He picked up the chest, heavier now with its knowledge than with its iron, and carried it toward the house. Each step felt like a step away from the life he had known, the simple rhythm of ranch work and quiet evenings. Ahead lay something uncertain, perhaps dangerous. Yet as the door of his house closed behind him, Jonas knew he had no choice but to carry it forward. Secrets this heavy did not stay buried forever. They clawed their way up through soil and silence until someone strong enough dared to face them. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the plains burned gold, Jonas sat at his table with the notebook open before him, the words of Sila Ward crawling across the page like shadows. The lamplight flickered against the walls, and the sound of Grace shifting in the corral drifted through the open window. He read and reread the final entries until the words etched themselves into his mind. I buried it where none will look. He closed the book at last, his jaw tight. He had looked. He had found. And now, whether he willed it or not, the past had become his responsibility. The night fell silent, the stars crowding the heavens. Jonas blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the darkness, the image of the chest seared into his thoughts. He had unearthed the truth, but he could already feel the stirrings of consequence. The land did not yield its secrets freely. Something told him this was only the beginning, and the price of knowing would soon come due. The morning after Jonas had spent long hours by lamplight reading Ward's papers, arrived with a peculiar stillness. The ranch, usually a place of routine where every sound matched the predictable rhythm of life, seemed to carry an edge of expectation, as though the land itself knew something had shifted. Jonas stepped outside with the weight of the notebook still heavy in his mind, the ring cold in his pocket, and the oiled canvas bundle secured inside the house. He moved through his chores, but his eyes wandered back to the oak where the broken boards of the old pit lay scattered. Grace had not gone near it since the chest was uncovered, and even now she paced along the far side of the corral, her ears twitching, her head tossing in restless unease. Jonas tried to busy himself with the cattle, forcing the routine upon himself as though work might steady his thoughts. Yet the faces of the names in Ward's ledger, men and families he had never met but whose struggles had been written down in merciless ink, hovered before him. He felt the weight of their stories pressing on him. The land he stood upon had been shaped not by the honest toil he gave it now, but by cruelty, theft, and betrayal. He had always believed in the virtue of steady labor, in the idea that a man's sweat was enough to earn his keep. Now he knew that beneath the soil lay deeds inked in corruption. It did not take long for whispers to stir in town. News traveled fast in places where little happened, and though Jonas had told no one of what he had found, the simple act of digging beneath the trough had been noticed. One neighbor had ridden by and asked why he was working the ground there, his tone casual but his eyes curious. Another man at the feed store inquired if Jonas had struck water or perhaps was building something new. Jonas gave short answers, unwilling to fan flames, but the questions had already begun. By the end of the week, it seemed half the town had heard that Jonas Hale had uncovered something strange on his property. The word strange was all it took for speculation to spread like fire across dry grass. The first visit came in the late afternoon, when the sun lay low and the heat clung heavy over the ranch. Jonas was mending a gate when a rider appeared at the edge of his land, a tall man in a dust-coated coat astride a lean horse. He approached at a measured pace, raising a hand in greeting. Jonas, wary but polite, wiped the sweat from his brow and waited. The man dismounted and introduced himself as Caleb Morris, a rancher from across the county line. He spoke of cattle prices and grazing rights for a time, his voice smooth and friendly, before his eyes drifted toward the oak tree in the displaced trough. He asked almost idly if Jonas had come across anything unusual while digging there. Jonas felt his gut tighten. He gave a flat answer, saying only that he had been checking the soil, but Caleb pressed a little harder, mentioning old stories he had heard as a boy about Scylla Ward and the things he was said to have hidden. His smile never wavered, but there was something cold behind it, a watchfulness that made Jonas's skin prickle. When Caleb finally mounted again and rode off, his farewell was courteous, but Jonas stood watching him until he disappeared beyond the horizon, knowing without doubt that the man's interest was more than idle curiosity. Over the next several days, more riders came. Some were strangers, men Jonas had never seen before, their questions blunt and their gazes sharp. Others were townsfolk who skirted around the subject with forced casualness. One evening, as Jonas passed through Dry Creek to buy supplies, he heard two old-timers in the saloon speaking in low tones about the Hale Ranch, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch words like Ward and buried. When he stepped into view, their conversation broke off instantly, replaced by uneasy silence. At night, Jonas sat on his porch, the chest hidden inside, the notebook close at hand, and listened for sounds beyond the normal chorus of crickets and coyotes. Twice he heard the crunch of footsteps near the barn, once the faint scrape of metal against wood. He rose with his rifle in hand, calling out into the dark, but whoever lingered there melted away into the night before he could catch a glimpse. Grace, too, seemed restless, stamping her hooves and snorting, her eyes fixed on the shadows. The unease grew until it pressed on Jonas like a physical weight. He thought of the papers again, of the ledger entries that tied Henderson's name, subtly but enough towards dealings. Henderson was no longer the young man he had been when he bought the ranch at auction, but his influence had grown vast in the years since. He held sway in the county, his lands wide and his connections deeper than Jonas liked to imagine. If Henderson had profited from Ward's thefts, then he would have every reason to keep those papers buried. Jonas began to understand the danger. The chest did not just hold proof of Ward's misdeeds, it hinted at a network of deceit that stretched across the territory. Henderson and men like him had built their fortunes on land that may never have been theirs. To reveal the truth would be to unseat power, to unravel threads that had been tightly bound for decades. And men like Henderson did not let such things slip without a fight. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the plains in shades of red, Jonas sat at his table with the notebook open before him. He read again the final entries, the ones scrawled with desperation. "If they come, I will have something to bargain with," Ward had written, his words slanted and fevered. Jonas wondered if those men had indeed come for Ward, if they had dragged him to his fate because of the very chest that now sat in Jonas's keeping. A shiver ran through him at the thought that the secret he had unearthed might draw the same fate upon himself. Still, he could not bring himself to bury it again. He had thought of it more than once. He had considered hauling the chest back to the pit, covering it with earth, and restoring the trough. Yet each time the thought came, he saw Grace's eyes, dark and knowing, and he remembered the instinct that had led him here. To bury it again would be to betray that instinct, to betray the truth itself. The choice pressed harder with each passing day. He could keep the chest hidden, guard it with his life, and live under the shadow of secrecy. Or he could take it to the sheriff, place the burden in the hands of the law, and risk the wrath of men like Henderson. He knew already which path was right, though the weight of it settled heavy on him. A man who carried truth had no business keeping it locked away, no matter how dangerous. That night, as the moon rose bright and clear, Jonas sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The land lay silent, but he did not trust its silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men were speaking his name, wondering what he had found, planning perhaps what they might do to claim it. He looked to the corral where Grace shifted in the moonlight, her muscles taut, her gaze turned always toward the oak. She had guided him here, and now her unease warned him of the storm to come. Jonas gripped the rifle tighter, his mind made steady by the decision that had already taken root in his heart. The papers would not stay silent. He would not let them. When the dawn came, he knew he would ride into Dry Creek, chest and notebook in hand, and place them before the sheriff. Whatever storm followed, he would meet it head on. Secrets had been buried long enough, and the land itself seemed to demand they be brought into the light. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, though the skies were clear. Jonas lifted his eyes to the stars, countless and cold, and felt the unease within him sharpen into resolve. This was no longer just his burden. It belonged to every man whose name had been written in Ward's ledger, every family that had suffered because of it. He could not shield himself by silence. The truth had found him, and now it called to be spoken. As he rose and walked back into the house, the weight of the ring in his pocket pressed against his leg. He touched it without thinking, feeling the engraved initials, the tarnished band that once belonged to a man long gone. It was more than jewelry, it was evidence, a relic of a life stolen. He placed it beside the notebook on the table, and for a long moment he stared at both. Tomorrow he would act. Tonight he would wait. And in that waiting, in the stillness before the storm, he understood with absolute certainty that his life as it had been was already over. Dawn came gray and cool, the kind of morning that carried a deceptive calm, as though the world had not been turning toward unrest all along. Jonas Hale stood in the doorway of his ranch house, with the chest at his feet and the notebook in his hand, the lamplight behind him giving way to the pale glow of morning. He had not slept much, for his mind had been fixed on what was to come. Through the open window he had heard Grace shift in her corral, restless through the night, stamping at the earth as though she too sensed the weight of what the day would bring. When Jonas finally stepped out with the chest, her ears turned sharply in his direction, her dark eyes following him with an intensity that was both unsettling and reassuring. The decision had been made the night before, when he had sat with the ring and the papers laid out before him. He knew now that keeping them hidden would be no less than surrender to the same silence that had ruled this land for decades. Scylla Ward's secrets had poisoned the ground, and Henderson's empire had been built upon that poison. To bury the chest again would mean allowing those roots to remain, unchecked, twisting through the lives of men who had already suffered too much. Jonas was no crusader, no man of politics or law, but he was a man of conscience, and conscience gave him no other path. By the time the sun broke the horizon, he had loaded the chest onto his wagon, tied it down with ropes, and saddled Grace to ride beside. The trip into Dry Creek was not long, But that morning the road seemed different. Every mile weighted with consequence. Dust rose behind the wagon wheels, catching the first light of the day, and the wide plains opened on either side, their silence profound. Jonas rode with his eyes scanning the horizon, alert for riders who might have heard the same whispers that had reached him. Twice he thought he saw figures moving at a distance, shadows against the glare. But they never drew close. Dry Creek was just beginning to stir when Jonas arrived. The blacksmith's hammer rang against metal, echoing down the single main street, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the small bakery. The saloon's doors were propped open to let out the stale air of the night before. Heads turned as Jonas guided his wagon down the street, the chest lashed at the back, drawing more attention than he liked. He saw the narrowed eyes of men who had already guessed, saw the hurried whisper of a woman who pulled her child closer as he passed. The sheriff's office stood near the end of the street, its sign faded, its windows streaked with dust. Sheriff Thomas Crowley was inside, a man well into his 50s with a lean build hardened by years of work and eyes that missed little. He looked up from his desk as Jonas entered, the door creaking behind him. Jonas lifted the notebook first, then gestured toward the wagon outside. The sheriff listened without interruption as Jonas laid out what he had found, his voice steady despite the weight of the story. When he finished, Crowley leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, and let out a low whistle. "You understand," the sheriff said finally. "This isn't just old papers. This is evidence. It's a fuse, and once it's lit, there's no telling how far the fire will run." "I understand," Jonas answered, "but it can't stay buried." Crowley nodded slowly, then rose and walked outside with Jonas. Together they unloaded the chest, carrying it into the office. The sheriff broke the seals on the ledger, read through several pages, and his expression hardened. "Ward was worse than folks guessed," he said, "and Henderson's name is tied up in this more than once." He closed the book and met Jonas's eyes. "You've done the right thing bringing it here, but you've also made yourself a target." The words were hardly spoken when the first ripple of consequence reached them. By midday, word had spread across town that Jonas had delivered Ward's papers into the hands of the law. Men gathered in knots along the street, some speaking of justice long overdue, others muttering of the trouble that would follow. Henderson's name was on every tongue. Some recalled land their fathers had lost, others debts that had never been repaid. Faces hardened with anger, voices rose with the stirrings of old resentment. It was as though Jonas had torn the cover off a wound the town had long pretended was healed. By evening, trouble arrived in the form Jonas had feared. Riders came down the street, 3 men in Henderson's employ, led by Marcus Reed, a foreman known for his loyalty and his fists. They dismounted outside the sheriff's office, their spurs jangling, their expressions tight with menace. Reed demanded the chest, claiming it was Henderson's property, stolen from his ranch. Sheriff Crowley stepped outside, rifle in hand, and told them in no uncertain terms that the chest was now evidence in a criminal investigation. For a long, tense moment, it seemed blood might spill right there in the dust of Dry Creek's main street. Then Reed spat, muttered that Henderson would not forgive this insult, and mounted up again. The riders left, but their departure was no comfort. The message had been delivered. Henderson would not let the matter rest. Jonas spent that night under the sheriff's roof, his wagon and horse guarded by deputies. He barely slept, his ears straining for the sound of hooves or gunfire. When dawn came again, it brought with it not peace but escalation. Men loyal to Henderson were seen riding the roads, watching who came and went from town. Strangers lingered near the saloon, their hands never far from their belts. The tension thickened by the hour, until even the ordinary townsfolk began to whisper of violence coming. Yet for all the fear, there was also a strange stirring of hope. Families who had long kept silent began to speak up, their voices low but resolute. An old woman whose husband had lost his farm to Ward came forward with stories that matched those in the ledger. A man who had worked as a clerk for Henderson years ago hinted at forged documents and false claims. One by one, the townspeople began to add their voices to the rising tide, the buried wrongs of decades surfacing with the same inevitability as the chest itself. Jonas watched all this with a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. He had not sought to lead anything, had not wanted to stir such waters, yet he could not deny that truth once spoken had a power of its own. He had delivered the evidence, and now it carried its own weight beyond his control. Still, the danger pressed close. Twice in the days that followed, he was warned not to walk alone after sundown. Twice he found fresh tracks near the sheriff's office where men had lingered in the night. Grace remained unsettled, her instincts sharp, her body tense whenever strangers approached. The confrontation came sooner than Jonas expected. One late afternoon, Henderson himself rode into town, flanked by half a dozen men. He was older now, his hair graying, his frame thicker with age, but his eyes were cold and sharp as ever. He demanded that the sheriff release the chest into his custody, declaring that it contained personal property unjustly seized. The sheriff stood firm, presenting the documents as evidence of fraud, theft, and perhaps even murder. The crowd that had gathered outside the office grew restless, their anger rising as Henderson's arrogance laid itself bare. Jonas stood at the edge of that crowd, watching the man whose influence had long overshadowed the town. For a moment, Henderson's gaze met his, and in that glance Jonas saw not only fury, but something like recognition. Henderson understood who had unearthed the truth, who had brought it into the open. Jonas felt the weight of that look settle on him like a mark, a promise of retribution. The sheriff held his ground, his deputies armed at either side, and Henderson, though fuming, finally turned his horse and rode out again. But he left with words that chilled the air. This won't end here. And yet, in the weeks that followed, it did end, though not in the way Henderson intended. The territorial judge was called, hearings were held, testimony was gathered. The chest and its contents were laid out in the courthouse, the ledger read aloud to gasps and murmurs. Men who had once been cowed by Henderson's wealth found courage in the face of undeniable proof. Land deeds were challenged, fraudulent claims overturned, and families wronged long ago began to reclaim what was theirs. Henderson, stripped of his power and facing warrants for his arrest, fled under cover of night, leaving his empire to crumble behind him. For Jonas, life on the ranch changed in ways he could not have predicted. For months, his land became a place of gathering, where officials came to verify the site of the buried chest, where neighbors came to ask questions, to share their own stories, to find some measure of closure. The oak tree under which the trough had stood was no longer just part of his yard. It was a marker, a place where silence had been broken, where truth had clawed its way out of the ground. In time, the officials left, the papers were filed, and the storm quieted. Jonas repaired the broken boards of the pit and filled the earth back in, not to hide it again, but to lay it properly to rest. He built a small stone marker there, plain and unadorned, as a reminder that the land remembers, and that justice, though slow, sometimes rises from the soil. He placed the trough in a new spot, well away from the oak, and when he filled it with water, Grace approached without hesitation. She lowered her head and drank deeply, her body at ease, her fear gone as though the weight that had troubled her had finally lifted. Jonas often watched her at that new trough, the way her muscles relaxed, the way her ears flicked peacefully as she drank. In those moments he felt a strange gratitude, not only for her instinct but for the bond that had guided him. It was she who had first refused, she who had drawn his attention to the earth that hid a secret. Without her, the chest would still lie buried, the lies intact, the crimes unchallenged. He owed the mare more than feed and water. He owed her the truth itself. Seasons passed, and the land slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The ranch was his still, though he no longer saw it only as soil to be worked and cattle to be tended. It was a place that had demanded truth and received it. Neighbors treated him differently, some with admiration, others with caution, but all with recognition that he was the man who had dragged the past into the light. Jonas himself felt no pride, only a steady certainty that he had done what was necessary. The weight of the chest was gone from his house, but its mark remained in the way people spoke of his name, in the way Grace drank peacefully at the trough, in the stone marker by the oak. On quiet evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the sunset burn across the plains. Grace grazing nearby, the wind stirring the grass in waves. He thought often of the words in Ward's notebook, the desperation in the scrawled lines. He thought too of the sheriff's warning, that evidence was a fuse and knew it had been true. The fire had run its course, and it had consumed Henderson's empire, but it had also cleansed, leaving behind a chance for something new. Jonas Hale was still just a farmer, still a man who rose with the sun and slept with the stars above him. But the land he walked now carried a different weight. It was no longer just inheritance, it was responsibility. And as long as he lived, he would remember the lesson Grace had taught him, that animals sense what men ignore, that the earth keeps its secrets only so long, and that when truth is ready to rise, it will find a way. The trough gleamed in the last light of day, and Grace lifted her head from its cool water, her dark eyes calm. Jonas breathed in the evening air, steady and sure, and knew that the land, at last, had been set right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable tale. Click on the video now, showing on your screen, to discover another shocking story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And share this video with your friends. Let them uncover the secret too.